Hey bookworms, it's Jade from Bedtime Bookworm and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here to tell you all of the books that I read in 2019. Getting back into my year wrap-up series, before I can tell you about my statistics or all of the book lists that I've been working on, I thought first I would tell you guys all of the books that I read during the year and what I rated them. That way you have a bit of a baseline for what I read last year and what is making it onto my list. When I did this last year, I named the book, I rated it, I said what age category and genre it was, and then I gave like a one-sentence review of the book. While that was fun, it was actually really hard to do and really hard to edit, specifically the one-sentence review part, because I was coming up with them on the fly. Regardless, this year I read more books than I did last year, and so I think I'm going to drop the one-sentence review part just because it's really time-consuming to come up with the one-sentence reviews and it adds a lot of editing time. So instead, I'm going to keep it really simple and I'm just going to name the book, the age category, genre, and what I rated it. I will have all of my monthly wrap-ups down in the description box, so if you see a book that you missed me talking about throughout the year and you want to know more thoughts about it, you can definitely go check out my monthly wrap-ups. I also think these Everything I Read videos are a good way to introduce my channel to new people because it gives you a really good sense of what my reading tastes are like. I know not all of you watching were here for all of 2019, so you might not have known that I read some of these books, and that's why I'm here to tell you about them. So I'm going to have Goodreads pull up on my phone, and I'm just going to go month by month and tell you the things that I read. So in the month of January, I picked up 4 books. I read 3 of them and I DNF'd 1. The first book that I finished in January 2019 was Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor, the second book in the Strange the Dreamer duology. This is a YA high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Hero of Ages by Brandon Sanderson, which is the third and final book in the Mistborn series. This is an adult high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. And then I read This Cruel Design by Emily Suveda, which is the second book in the This Mortal Coil series. And this is a YA science fiction dystopian that I also gave 5 out of 5 stars. So January was a really good month, despite having 1 DNF, and the book that I DNF'd was Crimson Bound by Rosamund Hodge, which I gave 2 out of 5 stars. And then in February, I again read 4 books, and this time 2 of them were rereads. The first book that I finished was Knife of Dreams by Robert Jordan, which is the 11th book in the Wheel of Time series. This was a reread, and this is an adult high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. I also read Into the Bright Unknown by Ray Carson, which is the third and final book in the Gold Seer trilogy. This is YA fantasy / historical fiction. It's historical fiction with a magical element, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I also read King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. This is the first book in the Nikolai duology, which I also gave 5 out of 5 stars. I definitely found a lot of favorites at the beginning of 2019. The last book that I read in February was Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb, which is the first book in the Farseer trilogy, which was my second reread of the month. And I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. Moving on to March, I read 6 books in March, one of which was a reread. The first book that I finished that month was the reread. It was The Gathering Storm by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. This is the 12th book in the Wheel of Time series. This is an adult high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read Peace and Turmoil by Elliot Brooks, which is the first book in the Dark Shores series. This is an adult high fantasy that I gave 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is the first book in the Sixth World series. This is an adult urban fantasy that I gave 3 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Priority of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. This is an adult high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Book Thief by Marcus Zuzak. This is mostly marketed as YA, but in some places it's marketed as adult, so it could go either way, but it's a historical fiction. It's a World War II historical fiction that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. And then the last book that I read in March was The Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan, which is the first book in the Something Dark and Holy series. This is a YA high fantasy that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then in April, I read 4 books. The first one was Towers of Midnight by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson. This is the 13th book in the Wheel of Time series. It's an adult high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Storied Life of A.J. Fickery by Gabrielle Zevin. This is an adult contemporary that I gave 5 stars. Then I read Now I Rise by Kirsten White, which is the second book in the And I Darken series. This one is always really hard to put in a genre, but it's YA and it's an alternate history, so it's kind of fantasy, but there's no magic. It's a gender-swapped Vlad the Impaler retelling, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, which is the first book in the First Law trilogy. This is an adult high fantasy that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then in May, I read 8 books. The first one I finished was My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by Frederick Bachman. This is an adult contemporary that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read A Memory of Light by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, which is the 14th and final book in the Wheel of Time series. This is adult high fantasy, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars, of course. Then I read Stillhouse Lake by Rachel Kane. This is the first book in the Stillhouse Lake series. This is an adult mystery thriller, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Loneliest Girl in the Universe by Lauren James. This is a YA sci-fi thriller that I loved, and I gave 5 out of 5 stars. And then I read Planetfall by Emma Newman, which is the first book in the Planetfall series. This is an adult science fiction that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. I also read The Haunted by Danielle Vega, which is the first book in the Haunted series. This is a YA horror book that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Orphan Queen by Jodi Meadows, which is the first book in the Orphan Queen duology. This is a YA high fantasy that I gave 3 out of 5 stars. And then the last book that I read in May was The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne. This is an adult historical fiction. I don't know, I think in some places it was probably marketed as YA, but it's a World War II historical fiction told from the point of view of a young child. And I gave this one 3 out of 5 stars. Then in June, I read 6 books. The first one I read was The Ruins by Scott B. Smith. This is an adult horror book that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. Then I read Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. This is an adult science fiction that leans horror, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read The Black Prism by Brent Weeks, which is the first book in the Lightbringer series. That is an adult high fantasy that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read And the Trees Crept In by Dawn Kurtagich. This is a YA horror book that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. I also read Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate, which is an adult historical fiction that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. And then I read Wicked Fox by Kat Cho, which is the first book in the Kumio series. This is a YA urban fantasy that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Moving on to July. In July, I read 9 books. That was definitely the most books that I read in a month out of the whole year. First, I finished Half a King by Joe Abercrombie, which is the first book in the Shattered Sea series. This is a YA high fantasy, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars.
Hey guys, while editing I realized I skipped, I think, 3 books, so I'm inserting them now. The first book that I actually read in July was The Mirror King by Jodi Meadows, which is the second book in the Orphan Queen duology. This is a YA high fantasy that I gave 2 out of 5 stars.
Then I read Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, which is an adult horror novel, and I gave that 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read Kill River by Cameron Robeek, which is another adult horror book, and I gave that 3 out of 5 stars. I also read Recursion by Blake Crouch, which is an adult sci-fi thriller, and I gave that 5 out of 5 stars. I also read Gemina by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, which is the second book in the Illuminae files. This is a YA science fiction thriller that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. I also read Sorcery of Thorns by Margaret Rogerson, which is a YA high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. I also read Wilder Girls by Rory Power. This is a YA dystopian leaning horror. I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I ended the month with I Call Upon Thee by Anya Aldborn, which is an adult horror novella, and I gave that 4 out of 5 stars. Then in August, I read 4 books, and I had 1 book that I DNF'd. I read House of Salt and Sorrows by Aaron A. Craig, which is a YA high fantasy that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read I'll Give You the Sun by Jandy Nelson, which is a YA contemporary that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. I also read The Downstairs Girl by Stacey Lee, which is a YA historical fiction that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. I also read The Blinding Knife by Brent Weeks, which is the second book in the Lightbringer series. This is an adult high fantasy, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. And the one book I DNF'd that month was Something Borrowed, Something Blood-Soaked by Krista Carmen. This is an adult horror short story collection, and I gave it 2 stars. In the month of September, I read 5 books. The first book that I finished was The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. This is an adult mystery thriller with a historical feel and some other things I can't talk about. It's a bit of a genre bender, but unfortunately I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I also read Darkest Hours by Mike Thorne, which is another adult horror short story collection, but I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. I also read Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey, which is the first book in the Expanse series. This is an adult science fiction book, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read Obsidio by Amy Kaufman and Jay Kristoff, which is the 3rd and final book in the Illuminae files. This is a YA science fiction thriller, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. And then I ended the month with All Systems Red by Martha Wells, which is the first novella in the Murderbot Diaries. This is adult science fiction, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Then in October, I read 6 books, one of which was a reread. I read Come Closer by Sarah Gran, which is an adult horror novella, and I gave that 4 out of 5 stars.
I also read Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. This is an adult mystery thriller that I gave 5 out of 5 stars.
Then I read The Nightmare Room by Chris Sorensen, which is the first book in the Messy Man series. This is another adult horror. It was October after all, and I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then I read I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This is an adult horror, post-apocalyptic, I would call it a novella. It was pretty short, and unfortunately I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I also read Royal Assassin by Robin Hobb, which is the second book in the Farseer trilogy. This was my reread for the month, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And then I ended the month with Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This is an adult horror book that I gave 4 out of 5 stars. In November, I picked up a total of 6 books, but one of them was a DNF, so I read 5, and 2 of the 5 were rereads. I read The Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. This is an adult mystery thriller that I gave 5 out of 5 stars.
I also read If You See Her by Anya Alborn. This is an adult horror book that I gave 3 out of 5 stars.
I also read Hex by Thomas Old Huvelt. This is an adult horror book that I gave 2 out of 5 stars. Then I read, or reread rather, Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor, which is the first book in the Strange the Dreamer duology. I did give this book 4 out of 5 stars on this read, but it was definitely a 5-star book the first time I read it. Just throwing that out there. And this is a YA high fantasy. And then I read Assassin's Quest by Robin Hobb, which is the 3rd and final book in the Farseer trilogy. This is an adult high fantasy that I gave 5 out of 5 stars. And then the book that I DNF'd was The Secret Scripture by Sebastian Barry. This is an adult historical fiction, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. And then in the month of December, I read 4 books. I read The Last Dragon Princess by Cynthia Payne. This is a YA high fantasy that I gave 3 out of 5 stars. I also read Nosferatu by Joe Hill, which is an adult horror book, and I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. I also read Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, which is the first book in the Alex Stern series, and this is an adult urban fantasy paranormal book, which I gave 4 out of 5 stars. And then I ended the year with The Broken Eye by Brent Weeks, which is the 3rd book in the Lightbringer series. This is an adult high fantasy, and I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Those were all of the books that I read in 2019. I have plenty more end of year type of videos coming. My stats video should be next, and then I gotta do my best of, my worst of. I usually do a most disappointing, most surprising video, but I'm not sure if I want to do one of those this year. And I usually do a best and worst audiobook video, and I have a couple of ideas that I'm still kind of on the fence about. So if you guys have any requests for videos that you want to see wrapping up my 2019 reading year, definitely leave them for me down in the comment section, because while I know some of the videos that I'm doing, I'm open to other ideas as well. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more bookish content. That is all I have for now. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bookworms, keep reading. Bye.